Despite February being a short month and a very busy month for my job, including quite a bit of travel, I was able to finish 8 books in the month of February, including 4 works of classic fantasy, 2 works of modern fantasy, a work of crime fiction, and a memoir. And let me tell you, this month's book of the month is easily one of the biggest surprises that I've read in probably several years. So these are my February book reviews. Hey everyone, and welcome to my February book roundup. I'm going to share with you short reviews and ratings for the 8 books that I read this month. I mentioned the genres, so I'm just going to jump right in. If you want to skip to a certain genre, I will put chapters below, but make sure you come back and check out that book of the month because it is truly one of the biggest surprises I've had in quite some time. Some of you won't like it, but a lot of you will. Let's go ahead and start with a work of crime fiction. I read The Drop by Dennis Lehane. Dennis Lehane is one of my favorite authors of crime fiction. I used to read a lot of crime fiction, and there are only 3 or 4 authors that I continue to read, and Lehane is one of them. What I like about Lehane is, like most great writers in this genre, the books are superbly plotted. But beyond that, he creates great characters that you connect with, and in this one, that was pretty remarkable because this is a really thin book. I read this in probably less than 3 hours. And he also, the other thing I like is these are grittier kind of works of crime fiction. Not that any crime fiction is without that grit, but these are grittier. You often have characters that are maybe a little bit more, have nebulous motivations, a little bit more morally ambiguous characters. And of course, like most great authors in this genre, plot twists. This one has a killer one at the end. Really short read. I wouldn't put this up with any of Lehane's greatest works. However, if you haven't read Lehane, this might be a good entry point to check him out because it is so short. But I really enjoyed The Drop by Dennis Lehane, and I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5. Okay, let's go on to classic fantasy next, and let's start with Magician by Raymond E. Feist. Now, if you saw my TBR video, I've talked about how this is a reread of sorts. I have read twice in my life the 2-volume version of Magician when it was published as Magician Apprentice and Magician Master. But this is the author's definitive version. It restores some of the text that was cut when it was originally published. And I gotta tell you, comparing the 2-volume work to the 1-volume work, I prefer this without a doubt. I think it shows the scope of this story quite a bit more. Now, if you don't know what this is classic fantasy from the 80s, and it has a lot of your favorite fantasy archetypes. We have the kind of the orphaned young boy. He's not a farm boy in this case, but might be a chosen one perhaps, and we get a wizard trope, and you get the fellowship trope, and the quest, and the journey, and all of those things in there. But Feist has enough inventiveness in this series to make it feel a lot different. In fact, having reread a lot of the works from the 80s that I read at the time, Dragonlance, Raymond E. Feist, Terry Brooks, David Eddings, I think Feist was the one that strayed from that formula from the start. Most of those authors, well, Eddings didn't, but most of those authors did start to cut new ground as they got further established into their series. But from the beginning, this is something different. And again, I like the single volume work because I think it lends more to the scope of this book. This is the Rift War saga. This is the beginning, and the Rift is literally a rift that connects worlds. So it's not just a fantasy story. It tells 2 different entire worlds. And when one of the characters goes to that second world and you start to see the exploration of culture, especially, you realize that this is a lot different from what was being published at the time. It feels a lot modern, more modern to my eyes. And I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed seeing Pug again, but even though it strays, there's a lot of the famous tropes that we love so much in the fantasy genre, but done very well. I am rereading Rift War Saga, these first 3 books, or 4 books, depending how you count this one, because I'm going to read the Empire trilogy that Feist wrote with Janny Wirtz starting in July. So this is kind of just refreshing my memory into this world. And I'm so glad I did because I love this book. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5, and I'm looking forward to reading Silverthorn next month. Another work of classic fantasy that was a reread from a very long time ago for me was Prince Caspian by C.S. Lewis. This is the second published book in the Chronicles of Narnia. I am reading the 7 books in publication order, 1 per month this year. I was delighted with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This one, not so much. There's kind of 2 stories here. You have the story of the kids from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then you have the story of Prince Caspian. And I loved both of their stories. But I felt when the 2 stories finally converged, I was kind of bored, and it was just kind of lackluster ending to this book. But I am enjoying Narnia. It's fun to go back to something that I read for the first time in 6th grade. And even though I gave Prince Caspian a 2.5 out of 5, I am really looking forward to reading The Voyage of the Dawn Treader next month. All right, my last 2 works of classic fantasy are both in this omnibus edition of Elric of Melniboné. The first 2 books in this series by Michael Moorcock are Elric of Melniboné and The Fortress of the Pearl. Although they were written almost 20 years apart because The Fortress of the Pearl wasn't written until the late 80s. But the omnibus edition is putting them together, I think, in the chronological order of the character. So even though it was written later, it kind of happened second in the chronology. I really like jumping into this world. First thing I like is nothing against epic fantasy, but it's refreshing to read fantasy that's short. Authors, fantasy doesn't have to be 800 pages to be great. And it's proven here. The first book here is less than 200 pages, Elric of Melniboné, and it's fantastic. It has great world building, has great characterization. It tells you what the author is telling, and it's quite different from what most of these other authors I think were doing at the time. It's a much darker world. Elric is a very conflicted kind of hero, both conflicted as a character and I think conflicted as a reader as far as what you think about him. In many ways, and I don't know, I've never seen anyone make this comparison, so I'm going to make it. In many ways, he reminded me of Fitz in this first book. In the way he reminded me of Fitz, of course, from Robin Hobb's Realm of the Elderlings, written decades later, what he reminded me of is Elric does some stupid things in this first book, just like Fitz does through the entirety of the Realm of the Elderlings. But you're still wanting him to be right, and you're still cheering for him. So that reminded me a little bit. I also liked how I could see very clearly how Joe Abercrombie and authors of that vein took this as one of their influences. Because this is, you find out very early on, this is not, to give the big comparison, this is not Tolkien type of fantasy. This is very different. This is much darker, much grimmer, much more ambiguous kind of storytelling. And I like that aspect of it. But it still feels modern and classic at the same time, if that makes any sense whatsoever. I think the characterization has still progressed beyond this, but I believe that at the time, this is probably some of the more focused, at least singular characters that I've read, at least from that era. So I have more to read, of course, but I really enjoyed Elric the character. The first book is the first story, Elric of Melniboné, and it has quite a bit of kind of familial and court intrigue, and I really enjoyed that. You get quite a bit of magic, which I enjoyed, and you get a lot of this character, which I'm always a character first reader, so I enjoyed getting to know Elric quite a bit. I gave the first book, Elric of Melniboné, a 4 out of 5. Really enjoyed it. Second book, Fortress of the Pearl, probably similar enjoyment level. I gave it a 3.5 out of 5. This one is a quest, more of a quest fantasy, and I love that. But I just felt certain elements of it, especially the quest portion, it kind of dragged on a little bit in the middle towards the end. But I will say that the end of The Fortress of the Pearl was magnificent. There's a plot twist I didn't see coming, which was absolutely brilliant. So some of my viewers see a 3.5 and think that's a bad book. That's not a bad book. That's something I really enjoyed. And I really enjoyed The Fortress of the Pearl. And I look forward to continuing. There's 2 more in this omnibus that I'll be reading very soon. All right, on to modern fantasy. I read Wizard of the Pigeons by Megan Lindholm, which, if you didn't realize, Megan Lindholm is Robin Hobb. Robin Hobb is actually the pseudonym and the name that she uses when she writes more epic fantasy. And this is an urban fantasy about a wizard in Seattle. And There are aspects of it I loved. When I got to the end of this one, I I understood what the story she was telling, but to be honest, I don't think she pulled it off. I like thematically her idea behind this entire thing, and there's some great ambiguity at the end when you realize the theme that she's trying to tell, the story that she's trying to tell here. But as much as I love Hobb, top 10 author of all time for me, top 2 author, spoiler for my top 10 author video if you haven't seen it, I don't feel that she pulled it off entirely, because when I got to the end, unlike all of the Robin Hobb books, even my lowest rated books in Realm of the Elderlings, I didn't feel I connected with the characters here. So again, this is an early version of Hobb. It's a very different kind of story. I have no regrets reading it, and I will reread it because I did enjoy aspects of it, especially now knowing at the end what she was talking about thematically and what she was trying to do. Reading that with that kind of more critical lens and a little bit more knowledge going in, I think I might enjoy it a bit more. But overall, I did enjoy Wizard of the Pigeons. I give it a 3.5 out of 5. Now, the other work of modern fantasy that kind of blew me away this month was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. Now, the one thing you hear universally about Piranesi is don't read the back flap, so I didn't, and go in blind. Go in not knowing anything about this. And I did. And that was great advice. So I give that to you if you haven't heard that advice. But I want to take that a step further, because I will say that had I read the back flap, or had I known what this was going to be about, I'm not confident that I would have read it, because it doesn't really sound like a compelling idea until you see how well she executes it. And my goodness, does she execute it well. This is, again, a really short story. I mean, work of fantasy. I would consider this literary fantasy, because this is really about the thematic elements, and even more than that, for me, the symbolism. Trying to understand I can't give away spoilers, what she was trying to do with various aspects of the world building. That's not spoiler talk. Various aspects of the world building being symbolic of other things is what really makes me think about this book. When I wrote my short review on Goodreads, I don't know if I put it there or if I was discussing this on one of the Discords, but I said that I think this is a book where the rating may raise through time, because we all know that happens. We finish a book and we have our initial assessment, and over time it may go up or down. I think this is one that's going to go up, because I continue to think about this. Yes, it's only been a few weeks, but looking at the stack of books that I just talked about, this is the one I've thought about the most since I finished it last month. So, Piranesi, go in blind, go in expecting nothing, except that it's a really well-written book with thematic depth and a lot of symbolism. A lot of things I didn't grasp, but I enjoyed. And it's another one, man, there's not enough time, but I want to reread this. And soon, maybe not this year, maybe I'll reread this beginning of next year. But I really enjoyed Piranesi. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5. So I just talked about a lot of great books, some classics, some works of modern fantasy, crime fiction that I loved. What is this big surprise that I'm talking about? Don't click away when I reveal it. Give me a minute to convince you that this is a good book, because my book of the month was a memoir by Matthew McConaughey called Green Lights.
All right.
Yes, Matthew McConaughey's book Green Lights is my book of the month. So hear me out. First of all, I listened to this as an audiobook, and as an audiobook, this is without a doubt the finest audiobook I've ever listened to, because of course he narrates it. And his delivery of his own words, literally in his own words, is picture perfect from beginning to end. And a lot of times I was reading this and I was wondering if I were reading the written page, would it come off as well? I can't say that for sure. In fact, I may buy a physical copy just to compare, to see if it comes off the page as well as it did as an audiobook. But as an audiobook, it's not very long. It was about 7 hours listening at 1.0, because that's the only way I listen to audiobooks. I loved it. I loved hearing his background. I loved hearing, one thing I love, I'm a musician, one thing I love and I never tire about hearing is any artist talk about their craft. And he's an actor, and you may scoff about him as an actor, but remember, he won an Oscar. He has a kind of method acting that I really enjoyed hearing him talk about. I loved hearing specifics about different aspects of the roles he took, what he put into that character, how he got that role, the different aspects of his story. And I enjoyed what I saw a lot of people criticize on Goodreads is his kind of philosophical ramblings. He himself calls it his folk philosophy, and I loved it. Maybe because I live in Austin, Texas, and he lives in Austin, Texas, and maybe I get it. I don't know. But I got to tell you, I really enjoyed Green Lights. If you read it, let me know what you thought. If you gave it a 1 out of 5, I wouldn't be surprised. But I also wouldn't be surprised if, like me, you loved it and gave it a 5 out of 5, because my book of the month for February 2022 is Green Lights by Matthew McConaughey. All right. That is my February book roundup. Have you read any of these books? Please let me know in the comments section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. And I'd also love to hear what your book of the month was in February. Let me know in the comments section. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter and Goodreads. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.